I grew up with storytellers. I grew up in and amongst stories. My father was a writer. He was Walter Dean Myers. He wrote young adult novels. My grandfather, although he couldn't read, was a storyteller. Was a great storyteller. Um, and that is the center of so much of my work is this practice and tradition of telling stories and finding new ways and different aspects to the story to tell the stories that are important to me and also to retell stories, to find ways to find myself in older stories, in classic stories, in stories in which me or my people have been written out. Um, so the practice of being an artist is an extension of that long tradition of storytellers from which I come. Um, I would say that visual arts or books or theater, all of it is a kind of storytelling. And even those people in my family who aren't like identified as artists are as invested in this idea of what it means to tell a story. And I think that that is such an essential human practice um, that I'm excited to be part of. It's like grand continuum of storytellers. So when I read an ancient myth or I see a religious story being told, I see that as being part of one continuum that I am too a part of.
So now kind of describe briefly, go fast forward to right now, and describe briefly the bodies of work. There's two, but the overall concept of the show here. And maybe tell us about the title of all creatures that can feel and think.
The title of All Creatures That Can Feel and Think is from the play by Euripides, Medea. And Medea is one of our oldest stories. It's about a mother who, confronted with a life that is out of control, makes a desperate choice. And it's a hard story. It's a story that resonates with so many people across generations. Um, and it resonates for me as a person who's watched the world recently go through so much kind of desperation, so much strife, and to see all the choices that people are making. Um, we always have a sense that we live in unique times. And I'm of the school that as unique as we may think our times are, there is always some story to go back to understand where we are and who we are a little better. For me right now, Medea is absolutely one of those stories, as well as the kind of tapestry of mythology and of thinking about our place in the world that Medea comes from. So Medea comes from this like the Greco-Roman mythos and all of the kind of cultural collision and cultural meeting that happens in that mythology. And so this work in this show is about that cultural meeting, all of those stories kind of woven together, braided together to make the tapestry of its own.
Okay, so that's kind of zooming in a little bit. More specifically, you talked about the story of Medea and why that resonates with you. How do you kind of uncover these stories? Does one lead to the next, like when you're starting a new body of work?
Mm. I used to work as a history researcher. That was my first job. My father hired me out to his other writer friends to say, hey, do this research on African Americans in Oklahoma or Texas, or do this research on labor history in West Virginia. And from that, I've gotten an insatiable hunger for these kind of well-researched, thought-through stories. And stories do lead to each other. When you think about Medea, you realize that, Medea's story is inseparable from the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea's husband was Jason, right? Similarly, Medea's story is inseparable from thinking about what does it mean to be foreign, right? So the figure of Medea is from Colchis, which is not of the culture that Jason is, and that's an essential question in the story of Medea. Similarly, when we think about Medea, we think about more contemporary antecedents, like contemporary versions of the story. You think about Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is in some ways influenced by the true story of an enslaved woman named Margaret Garner. The kind of long histories of what do we do in desperate situations? How do we understand our lives within the impossible choices that we face? All of these questions come up and keep coming up. And for me, that's how I get to the next story. It's not so much about deciding that there's some point of view that I need to stand on a mountaintop and proclaim. It's more about following stories and following my heart in relationship to those stories. Stories provide a framework for us to kind of understand ourselves. That's why they're so useful to us. That's why, even during the midst of the pandemic, everyone was talking about, what were you watching? What are the TV shows? Because faced with these unimaginable moments, faced with crisis or strife, we look to the framework of stories to tell ourselves who we are. And by following those breadcrumbs, I think that I hope to find the kind of richer testament of what I'm thinking about. That it's not simply about me, but it's about plugging into the kind of great river of story that we are all part of.
Yesterday we were talking, and you were describing how you kind of see the crazy Venn diagram of the intersection of gender, race, power, and religion in your work. Can you tell us about the works in the high ceiling room, which are interdisciplinary, and they're in fact part of a play that's entitled "I Say This to You and Make You Suffer." How does this work, which encompasses so many different works within it, does it reflect that intersection?
I fully believe that no story worth telling is only told once. We tell and retell stories. We change the format of how we tell the story. We find new things in each story. And for me, as an artist, my own storytelling desires run in many, many directions. I love literature. I love visual arts. I love theater as a kind of unification of some of the other things that I love. I love movement. And I don't think that I'll ever tire of telling a story and then telling it again in a new way. There's another line in the Euripides play, it's, "I say this to make you suffer." And it's this moment in which Medea is kind of sharing her desperation with Jason and sharing the idea that you may think everything is good in the world, but in fact everything isn't. And I'm suffering, and you should share in that suffering. Medea as a figure is wildly sympathetic to me. I care for her because I feel that the figure is someone whose world has been turned upside down, and who everyone around is saying, you should be chill with it, you should relax with it should be easy for you. And she doesn't want that. And I think that that is a familiar feeling for a lot of folks. When you look at the kind of culture of protest that we have seen in waves since the first time that we were brought here as African Americans, when you see the kind of cultural protest that goes on around gender, around all of the things, all of these people who are protesting are saying the same thing, which is that my suffering needs to be understood in a kind of broader context. Nobody takes it as perhaps Medea did, but that impulse to not suffer alone and in silence, I think is really important. In terms of the work, I am interested in these kind of Venn diagrams, the way that gender and race play against each other. Specifically, if you're like talking to like my high theory brain, there's one book called Caliban and the Witch, which really spoke to me, and it thinks about the kind of post-colonial figures, Caliban from the Shakespeare play, The Tempest, as a post-colonial figure, and the way that witches and the idea of witchcraft was often used to the category of deciding that people were witches or that they were involved in witchcraft, which was a way of kind of denying indigenous female kind of knowledge, that gendered knowledge was debased through this way of constructing the idea of what it means to be a woman. And all of that is of interest to me and endlessly fascinating in the ways in which the world is constantly doing backflips to disregard the knowledge of African Americans, of Asian Americans, of Latinos, of women, of queer people, all of the ways in which our knowledges and cultures are disregarded, and how much work that is actively done in the world to disregard those knowledges and to disregard those cultures, and at the same time, how much of the world is built on our cultures. And so I'm interested in thinking that all of that.
So you're connecting these ideas. Can you help us to connect them with the objects that we're looking at and the format of them? Maybe pick on something individually to highlight, but then talk about how that they're seen together as a play and what that means in terms of performance, because I think that's new in your work.
Right. I'll tell you about 3 pieces. And again, when you're a storyteller, you can't just kind of come out with the moral of the story first. You want to take people on a journey. And so all of these pieces are part of a journey. There's a shrine to Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was an African American woman from Baltimore who in the 1950s went to Johns Hopkins because she was complaining of health issues. Unbeknownst to her, her cells were harvested by the doctors at Johns Hopkins and were put into Petri dishes and have since then become the foundation of human cellular biology. The amount of cell material that has been cloned from this one woman, cervical cancer cells, if you took all of those cells, they'd be around 200 times the weight of her. She died of cervical cancer not too far from when she went to the doctors, but her cells have lived on. They're called an immortal cell line. Now, on one hand, this can be easily told as a story of erasure. Her family didn't even know that these cells were being reproduced throughout the world for all the scientific labs, that they were instrumental in, the vaccinations against polio and some of the early vaccines. Her cells were instrumental in that. So this is a story of erasure, but it's also a story of a kind of survival, a way of transformation, almost mythic in its proportion, this idea that there's a little part of this woman's body that is healing us even today. So in that, I wanted to kind of mirror that story with the story of reliquary that is in so many religious traditions. The finger bone of Saint Matthew, the hair of the prophet, all of these kind of like little objects that have great power. And there's a way in which you think of the kind of lives of like a woman like Henrietta Lacks, Black woman, poor from Baltimore. And she had maybe on one hand a little life, but her life had great power. And that, in and of itself, is something I think is worthy of a shrine. So there's these stained glass windows that are images of her cells. And then there's a microscope in which you can actually see her actual cell material. This is sort of an antecedent to this thought about who Medea was. As a person who had an outsized power, who kind of maybe had a small life, but whose story is resonating through the ages. And in that, this is the kind of theater that I want to make. I want to think about what does it mean to live that small life, and what does it mean to understand that that small life has bigger resonances, that small life that can be full of desperation and pain and whatever other kind of hurt can also resonate through the ages for 3,000, 4,000 years. And that's so much of what my work is, to take the small thing, to take the craft or the thing that is debased and to make it as large and as wide as I can.
So can we talk about your use of materials? Can you just elaborate on that?
So I use materials that are at once super familiar, and I try to bring them the kind of mythic weight that they deserve. So for example, there's a costume that is the back part of a centaur, a woman centaur named Hylonome, who functioned as like a kind of an educator in my Medea mythos. And it's made from recycled oil drums. So here's this like super quotidian material. It's used to make steel drums in Trinidad, and it's used to transport goods throughout the world. It's something that is so ubiquitous as to be invisible. But what I get to do then is to take it and make it into something remarkable, to take it and make it mythic. So I worked with steel workers in Kenya, outside of Nairobi. And we build these kind of creatures from this recycled oil drum. Similarly, all of the kind of quilt work is recycled material, essentially. This is all fabric that is, I collect on my travels, that I find in junk shops and attics and things like this. Fabric that I love for various reasons. And you bring it together in the most quotidian of ways you sew, right? And sewing is an art form that is, again, so ubiquitous as to be invisible. Everybody here is sitting in something sewn right now, but you don't think about the hands, the consistency of the stitching to make that happen. So then how do you transform, found fabric and stitching into something that is grand? That's my goal. That's what I'm trying to do.
And stained glass?
Stained glass, well, I grew up around stained glass. I went to a lot of churches growing up as a kid. And there's a way in which stained glass, it's almost a forgotten art form. There's not a lot of people who do it. There's some hobbyists, absolutely. I work with craftspeople in Guadalajara who make churches. And in that, I feel like there are so many stories that can be told. So often when we see stained glass, we associate it in a narrow way. We associate it with churches, end of story. And I think about how many more stories can be told, and how many ways in our own lives we can kind of live in that kind of bigger resonance. What needs to shine in that way? And stained glass is absolutely one of those materials that, in its nature, it feels like shining.
So behind you is the expansive tapestry with the image and story of Sarah Forbes Bonetta, and it's placed in the museum in the gallery as a transition point from one body of work to the next. You mentioned that the work deals with the feeling of being trapped or existing in two places at once. Can you tell us about the narrative, and why that you placed it as a pivot point between these two bodies of work?
So, Sarah Forbes Bonetta was a little girl that was kidnapped into slavery, was then traded to an Englishman, who then gifted her to Queen Victoria. Okay? She then was raised as a ward of Queen Victoria. So she leaves West Africa, she comes to England, and she's raised with the full blessings and the kind of the accoutrements of upper middle class girl in England. And she spent the rest of her life shuttling back and forth between West Africa and Europe, trying to find a way to kind of thread that needle, that cultural needle of who she was. She was on one hand the kind of girl who wrote letters to the Queen, talking about that she needed a new frock for a funeral, for a wedding. And then at the same time, she was absolutely, a black girl in the heart of Victorian England, the epicenter of a certain kind of colonial experience, the epicenter of the kind of legacies of slavery and colonialism that affect us to this very day. That in-betweenness, to me, that is the mythic moment, right? So we talk about people whose lives are, on one hand, small. She is shuttled back and forth between worlds, not necessarily because of her own desire, but because of her situation. But at the same time, what kind of resonance that has for all of us who find ourselves trapped between worlds, for all of us who find ourselves trying to thread the needle of what we are supposed to be versus what we are versus what we want to be, all of these kind of questions. I've read her letters, I have her letters, I started thinking about her alongside my family. We collected her letters, and my father wrote a book about her, called about her life. And from those moments, I thought about the idea of how mythic that story could be. There is in the center of the piece a small depiction of Hades kidnapping Persephone. Similarly, a young woman whose life is split between worlds, between the underworld and the world of a kind of a natural environment. And I think that when I look at Sarah Forbes Bonetta, I think of someone who is as mythic as that. And in that moment, there's a transition that I can talk about these specific, especially young women, Medea, Henrietta Lacks, to think about the kind of larger goals and playfulness of mythology. So much of the other work is about mythology in that way, in the ways in which these old stories, which are themselves mixtures and collections of other people's stories. And one of the things that I think is always interesting is the idea that Greek and Roman mythology is not linear. It's actually a collection of other stories from around the Mediterranean. All of these stories have resonance today, have a richness for us, have a way of sharing with us the knowledge that we too can think of ourselves in mythic proportions.
So this leads us to the body of work behind you in the Wilson Gibbs Gallery, which depicts kind of human-animal transformations and intersections and delves into those ideas of myth in a different way. You spoke about the question that it asks, how do we live with mythology in our work world today? Which is kind of, we started this conversation too in this work here. So in all of the works behind us, and maybe you can pick one of them to talk about particularly, kind of what sources of imagery inspired you to explore this kind of connection between myth and contemporary life and animal and human?
One of the things that is odd about the way that stories accumulate is that oftentimes stories start in the most serious ways. They start as religion, or they start as the kind of foundational myths. and then they slowly become parodies of themselves. And that's an odd thing about the way that the world of story works. And until eventually the story comes right back around and becomes serious again. When you think about the relationships of humans and animals, we have it all throughout our language. People talk about a wolf in sheep's clothing. They talk about wolfing down food or brave as a lion. These are all these kind of central mythological metaphors that we live with in almost invisible ways. And I'm interested in kind of revisiting them, taking them away from some of the moments of parody and saying, what was the truth that we were getting at with that? I mean, while so many sports teams are named after animals, while cars and logos on T-shirts are all these kind of heraldry of a sort. There is a deeper meaning there. There is an understanding of our relationship to a natural environment, our relationship to being able to see ourselves more clearly when we expand our field of vision. And so I go to some of these stories, especially stories from the 1800s, because there is this moment in the 1800s where there's a transition from thinking about stories as myth, as unknowable and esoteric mythologies, to transforming them into science, the burgeoning fields of anthropology or this sort of thing, are a way of scientificization, a mode of scientificization to take us above our myths. But of course, those too are myths. Those too are full of mythology. So specifically, thinking about some of the works here, there's a stained glass window. There are two stained glass windows we'll talk about. One is a portrait of a girl named Nongqawuse from South Africa, who is Xhosa. Excuse my pronunciation, not like Xhosa is poor. But in the 1800s, she, having been under the influence of some Christianity given to her through missionaries indirectly, she told her people that they needed to kill all of their cattle as a great sacrifice to push the colonials away from them. She got followers, they did kill their cattle and were subsequently without food and were easily conquered by the kind of colonial powers. But there is something there about the power of myth, that this 16-year-old girl could get that many people to follow her. On the other side, there's a mermaid that's based loosely on this song by Mississippi John Hurt called "Let the Mermaids Flirt with Me." And there are all kinds of mythologies concerning Black lives and the Atlantic and the waters that we crossed in order to come here. And when you hear a song that is half humorous and at the same time thinking about death, like that song, the chorus of which goes, blues all on the ocean, blues all on the sea. I can't stay here much longer. Can't stay here much longer. When my earthly trials are over, cast my body out to the sea. Save all the undertaker bills, let the mermaids flirt with me. And when you hear that, there is not only like kind of the humor and kind of deadpanness that Mississippi John Hurt brings to the song, but there's also this entire resonance and history of what our relationship is to the sea that we crossed. When you read some of the earliest narratives of enslavement, I think specifically of Olaudah Equiano's narrative, people are just mind-boggled by the transformation that the sea has in their life. When he's on the ship coming over to the United States and he says, there I am in an endless field of blue, And so this is where we can think of our lives as small. We can think of our lives as full of problems or full of pain. but also we should understand that all of those problems and all of those paintings have this mythic resonance, have a much larger life in the world than just ourselves.
Is there any other work you want to talk about?
No, I think I'm good. I think I'm good, but I will say that one of the gifts of mythology is that it always exceeds your telling of it. And what I am excited for is for all of this work to meet people and for them to find their own mythologies within it.
So that always is my last question is, what do you want the viewers to take away with? If that's
Yeah, I mean, what I want viewers, I want people to find what parts of their own personal mythologies they can see in this work. What myths do they feel like have yet to be told? And I want people to go about all the kind of storytelling forms that can go into making a personal mythology wider.
And what would you tell, Lacker's part of the university setting? You've got a pivotal role, people, and commitment to learning. What advice would you give students, young artists today?
One of the things that I'm passionate about is that there is no off limits to what I will read. I read a lot of things, and there's often a kind of a push in one direction or the other about what should we be reading. And I fully believe that we should be reading everything, and we should be finding ourselves in all of it. And I think that, when we look at kind of classical mythology, if you have a deeper understanding of it, we are all there already. It's already thinking about all of the kind of stories that are the most controversial things of today are in the center of kind of this classical mythology that is so revered by even the most conservative of academics. And I'm interested in that. So when you think about something, let's say like gender fluidity, and people want to think of that as a very recent invention, I think about Tiresias. There's an image of Tiresias in this show. And Tiresias, Zeus and Hera were one day having an argument about raunchy things that Zeus and Hera talk about. And as a way of settling their argument, they turned a guy named Tiresias into a woman for 7 years. And that is like a thinking about gender fluidity that was happening in a pre-classical time, right? And so all of the things that people are finding so controversial, for me, are always quite old. And I think that that's interesting. And I think that we should be reading everything just so that we don't think that we are brand new every 5 minutes. This idea of how brand new we are is quite boring.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.